Hello and welcome to the RedMars Podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Astro Jake, and today we are diving into one of the most pressing and futuristic topics in space technology, that is cyber warfare in space. So, my undergrad was actually in computer and internet security, and so I love discussions about this, threat models, and all kinds of stuff. And in today's day and age, where we're in another arms race with AI and trying to protect our countries and see which country will really get to that artificial general intelligence first, well, this is definitely going to play into this topic. So let's get in with the intro here and really discuss what we are really going to talk about today. So, when we think of war in space, we tend to imagine laser battles, Star Wars-style dogfights, or massive fleets of spacecraft. But in reality, the first real battle in space may not be fought with physical weapons at all. It may be fought with lines of code, encrypted signals, and artificial intelligence-driven cyber attacks, as we just mentioned. So, our satellites, space stations, future moon, and Mars colonies, they all depend on software, networks, and data links that could become targets for cyber threats. And as space becomes more commercialized and militarized, the risk of cyber warfare is increasing. Yes, I said militarized. There are many rumors and conspiracies out there of not only the Americans having weapons in space, but the Russians and Chinese also having weapons in space, and even possibly North Korea. So the threat is definitely there. So we're going to talk about threats. So let's break it all down. We'll start with, what are threats? How do we defend against them? And what does the future of cybersecurity in space actually look like? So this is going to be a fascinating topic for today, so let's jump into it. We're going to start with understanding the threats. What are we protecting against? Well, before we can talk about defending space systems, we have to understand exactly what we're defending against. So let's go through some of the biggest cyber threats in space today. First one is satellite hacking. So what is it to hack a satellite? Well, imagine you're an enemy nation, or a hacker with the right tools, and you manage to gain access to a satellite's control system. Well, what can you do with that? Well, you could shut it down entirely. You could manipulate the data, for example, changing GPS coordinates, which could disrupt military or commercial navigation. You could even control the satellite's thrusters, moving it out of position or crashing into other objects. And I feel, while I talk about this, disclaimer, I'm not giving any ideas to anybody. This is completely theoretical and hypothetical, and we just want to talk through what some of these threat models are. So let's continue on. Does this sound far-fetched? Well, not at all. So in 2007 and in 2008, suspected Chinese hackers reportedly interfered with 2 US satellites through compromised ground stations. And just last year, the hacking group Anonymous Sudan claimed they jammed signals from Starlink, from the Starlink satellite network. So this does happen and currently goes on today, and I'm sure currently the militaries from around the world are also defending against each other's attacks or whatnot on their systems. We just don't hear about it in real time unless it becomes evident to the public that something's going on. Then yeah, maybe they might come up with it, or they might just give some excuse of say, hey, our systems crashed and we don't know why, or somebody put some buggy code that crashed it. But yeah, that's what you could do if you gained access to a satellite. But let's talk a bit more about signal jamming and spoofing. This is another major issue that comes along with any type of, remote system like this, but signal jamming and spoofing. Well, jamming is when an attacker overwhelms a satellite's radio signal with noise, effectively blocking communication. If the military satellite can't receive commands, it can become more or less useless. And then there's spoofing. Spoofing is even scarier. This is when hackers send fake data to a satellite or spacecraft, tricking it into believing it's receiving legitimate instructions. You can do this to computer systems here on Earth, cell phones, you name it, hackers have done it. So a great example of this is in 2019, not even that long ago, reports surfaced that GPS signals in part of the Middle East were being spoofed, making ships and aircraft appear in the wrong locations. If that happens to a spacecraft in orbit, it could lead to some serious consequences. Threat number 3, data interception and malware in space systems. The final threat is data interception and malware attacks on space infrastructure. So modern satellites send and receive vast amounts of data, everything from military intelligence to financial transactions. If a hacker can intercept that data, they could steal classified information or disrupt entire economies. Even worse, what if malware is planted inside a spacecraft's software before launch? This could allow hackers to activate a cyber attack months or even years later. This is not just theory. During the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, hackers targeted the Viasat satellite network, which affected internet across Europe. How do we defend against this then? So how do we defend space systems, and how is that really different than here on Earth? So now that we've talked about threats, let's kind of talk about how we fight back. So encryption and secure communications. This is the first line of defense. Encryption, strong cryptographic protocols that prevent unauthorized access. So there's a catch. Traditional encryption methods can be cracked over time. This is why space agencies are investing in quantum encryption, which is theoretically impossible to hack. Then we have air gapping and autonomous security. So this strategy means keeping critical systems physically isolated from the internet to reduce exposure. But here's the challenge. Many satellites must communicate with ground stations, so they can't be completely air-gapped. This is where AI-driven security comes in. AI algorithms can detect anomalous behavior in satellite systems and take action before a cyber attack succeeds. There are also some other technologies that we won't go too much into, but these help keep attackers at bay by making them think they're attacking a system, but really attacking a decoy of sorts. So this is also known as, say, a honeypot, but we'll keep going. So defense number 3, redundancy and self-healing networks. One of the best ways to defend against cyber attacks is redundancy. Having backup satellites, backup communication links, and even backup AI-driven control systems. Future space systems may even have self-healing networks, or software that can automatically detect and repair itself after an attack. So what does the future of cybersecurity look like in space? So, are we heading toward a new kind of arms race? Really, the answer is yes, in my opinion. We've already talked about how AI is really taking over, and there's this almost new Manhattan Project here in the US to create the most powerful and advanced AI before our adversaries get there. So what does this mean then? Well, space militarization and international cyber tensions. The US, China, and Russia are all developing offensive and defensive cyber capabilities for space. But unlike traditional warfare, there are very few international treaties covering cyber warfare in space. Could we see a global cyber arms race in space? Some experts believe it's already happening. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of accusations over the past few years, and you can even go back even farther, around militarizing space between these nations. But no one really admits to it, obviously. They just push it on to the next. But with the acceleration of AI development in these countries, we very well could see that this arms race is definitely cyber-based rather than physical militarization. And we probably won't hear about it till well after these attacks have taken place or already taken place. Who knows? So, what about the role of private companies? It's not just governments. Private companies like Space, Blue Origin, OneWeb are launching massive satellite networks. But are they prepared for cyber attacks? Great question. Well, if one hacker compromises a major commercial satellite network, it could disrupt GPS, internet access, and even financial transactions worldwide. Just recently, Starlink has become a partner with Apple and T-Mobile here in the US for connecting internet and that through satellite systems. So now we have an even bigger target, I guess you could say, or environment that can be under a cyber attack, which brings us back to those ideas of threat models. And just to kind of touch on that for a second here, a threat model is nothing more than talking through a scenario at which something could be attacked. So, for example, a denial of service attack on a computer could be anything from walking up to that computer and beating it up with a hammer so that the computer no longer functions. You have just denied service to that computer. Or it could be overwhelming it with requests from other systems in a distributed denial of service attack. That is also possible. But all these conversations about how and when and if and all that describes a specific scenario that someone could conduct an attack is known as a threat model. And then you are to talk through how would you defend against those. That's more so all what we're talking about here today. So Cyber warfare in space isn't a futuristic concept. It's definitely happening right now, whether we hear about it or not. And some of these stories, as I mentioned, even as early as 2019 for the most recent one, and back in 2007, 2008, this definitely happens and continues to happen. And it's not the ones we hear about that are most concerning in my mind. It is the ones you don't hear about. So very interested to see in 5-10 years what we learn about after the fact of what is going on right now. So satellites, rovers, and space stations are all vulnerable to cyber attacks, and the stakes have never been higher. The future of space security isn't just about radiation shielding or asteroid defense. It's about securing the software that runs everything. And if you've listened to the past 2 podcasts where I talked about kind of an introduction to space computers and then went a little bit more deeper into the, hardware systems and what that software for error correcting code and all that looks like, we didn't really talk about security. That's why I really wanted to do this one here as well, and really talk through the other side of things from a cyber perspective and threat models and that. So it's definitely interesting to look at, and if you've never done any cryptographic or cyber courses, I definitely encourage you to go look at what tools are out there for doing such attacks. In my undergrad, we kept a hacking journal, and we were given sandboxes. Sandbox is not what your kids play in, but I guess it is. But in this context, a sandbox is like a playground for people hacking to experiment in a controlled environment. So we were given these Linux-based operating systems within these containerized environments, and containerized just means it's secluded from the rest of the system, runs independently, and kind of like a virtual environment. And what we did is we would perform different types of attacks on these environments, whether it's trying to get a raise of privileges, or break in through some credentials, or hacking some sort of Wi-Fi or whatnot. We would use tools such as Kali Linux or homegrown tools, languages like shell scripting, bash scripting. We'd use Python, you name it, we'd do it. Even some C++ attacks that exist in the standard library. There's bad practices in coding and you can exploit those. There's all kinds of stuff. We talk about this for days. Anyways, I just wanted to mention that we talked about different types of computer systems in space, and I mentioned that a lot of the hardened or radiation hardened systems are pretty old architectures or old systems, and with old systems comes old vulnerabilities. And you can look up, if you pick, say x86 architecture, and look up vulnerabilities and look at the past vulnerabilities of those system architectures for those processors, and then look at what radiation hardened systems are out there or whatnot. It's interesting to look at and just see what vulnerabilities exist. And then if you look at the current systems that are controlling satellites out there today, you'd be quite surprised on the number of systems that exist that are open and vulnerable, and they rely on people not knowing how or not knowing they exist in order to protect themselves. And it's definitely a interesting skill set, or a unique skill set, I guess is a better way to describe it, for people being able to hack these systems in space and get access to them, but it is possible. So you can definitely believe that there are adversary countries trying as we speak to get access to those controls and whatnot, and looking through all the vulnerabilities that are known and those that aren't, and trying new ways to gain access. With that, there are companies as well, like Google, that offer bug bounties for people that look at this, and this falls under more of an ethical hacking. But definitely an interesting topic. If you guys want to know more around cybersecurity and whatnot, definitely let me know. I'd love to talk more about it. And with my background in that area, would love to. Obviously, not everything is up to date because I have since transitioned into a space technology role for one of the major space companies, and so my focus has not been around the cybersecurity. So I definitely do not claim to be an absolute expert in this area, but I do have background knowledge and have had experience doing more of the ethical hacking back in the day. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up here. I appreciate everyone for tuning in to the RedMars Podcast. And definitely, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, comment, whatnot. I'd love to chat with you more. But as always, stay curious, keep looking up, and I will talk to you guys in the next episode. Take care, everyone.